Thank you. So I'm going to speak to you about compassion in education. And to begin, what I'd like to ask you to do is try a little experiment. So if you can put your things down and just take one hand and put it over your heart, and another hand and put it over your abdomen. And just close your eyes for a moment and see how that feels. And now reverse it where the hand that's on your heart goes to your abdomen and the one on your abdomen goes to your heart, and see how that feels. And now notice which way feels better and put it the way that it feels the best. And everyone is switching back. Now, how many of you actually have noticed that one feels clearly better than the other? Raise your hand. Now take a look. Isn't that amazing? And how many feel better with the left on top? Raise your hand. Okay, it's about a quarter. And how many feel better with the right on top? There you go. And that's the vast majority, actually. Look at that. Now, it's interesting, but compassion for other people actually begins with compassion for ourselves. So I'm going to tell you a story first about compassion that is really a moment for me right now, because my son is actually sitting right here in the front row. He's 21, a wonderful young man. And this is a story about when he was less than 1 year of age. And I've never told him this story. This is quite a moment. But I'm trained as a physician. And you may know that physicians start medical school with a high degree of empathy and compassion. That might surprise you. But as they track compassion and empathy through education in medicine, it gets less and less and less. It's a very serious problem about medical education. And there I was, a physician. I had trained actually in pediatrics. I had trained in adult psychiatry, child psychiatry. I was actually board certified. I was now with an NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health grant to study attachment. We had our first son. And I found that when he would cry, I would really care for him, and I could feel his suffering, and I would take care of him. And if he continued to cry, I would try to take care of him some more. And then if he continued to cry, something shifted inside of me. And there's a lot of people nodding their heads. And I would find that my muscles would get very tense. And he would continue to cry. And then I would find my jaw was like this, and I would get very, very irritated with him. And I would become anything but compassionate. I would become impatient, intolerant. I wouldn't be able to see him clearly, and that, of course, agitation in me only made him more agitated. So I was very, very confused. All the years of therapy I had to figure out what happened in my own childhood seemed to vanish at that moment. And I figured there must have been something that went on, so I made up something in my mind about my mother must have ignored me for a long time when I was a kid or something. That really didn't do much. So then I figured, okay, maybe it had something to do with what? I didn't know. Well, a flashback came to me where I was a pediatric intern and we were trying to save these young children, and they were crying in our faces, and yet we had to get a sample of their blood to save their lives. And we had to find a way to ignore, to become numb to their suffering, or we wouldn't have been able to care for them. And so then I said, okay, maybe what's happening is all that trauma of being a pediatric intern shut me down. And what was really amazing about it is it really helped about halfway. I became much more tolerant and patient with you, with my son, and I could be there for him. But still there were these moments when I would explode in irritation, which really confused me. So I had to do a lot more soul searching of why I would sort of flip a switch. How could I be compassionate sometimes, but not compassionate all the time? What was going on? Well, I met with a bunch of my pediatric co-interns from back in the day, and we had long talks, and I did a lot of internal reflection. And what I'm about to tell you is actually very embarrassing and shameful to tell you. But I came to realize for myself, as was true with my colleagues, that when we saw how helpless other people were, in this case we were pediatricians taking care of children, and how helpless their parents were, that helplessness in them evoked a feeling of helplessness in us. And we were never taught anything in our training of how to be aware of our emotions and soothe them. Zero, nothing. We were given nothing but instructions on how to care for the physical aspect of the body. And so I learned, in fact, that I wasn't prepared, but here's the part that changed everything. I realized that when I was an intern in pediatrics, I learned what unfortunately is very common among my colleagues in medicine. I learned to be extremely intolerant of the patient's vulnerability. And I began to hate them for their vulnerability, for their helplessness. And here I was, now a psychiatrist, taking care of my son, who at 3 months, 4 months, 5 months of age, of course, is incredibly what? Vulnerable and helpless. And when I realized that it was my own sad way that the socialization system, for me, and it turns out for many of my colleagues when we would speak alone about this, we could understand, in fact, that that situation of being faced with emotions that you cannot bear, you learn some mechanism of shutting them down. When I realized that it was my anger toward my own patients, as I was dressed in a white suit with sharp objects, you can imagine it's like being a soldier out angry at the very people we're trying to care for. It's bizarre. And then once recently I was a patient and my own doctor acted the same way. And I realized it's rampant throughout medicine, that if we're not training each other to actually be present with emotions, we can't be present for other people. And so what I learned, and it changed everything until he became an adolescent, but it changed everything because then I could be much more tolerant for the most part. He's saying, yeah, right. But then adolescence was a whole different thing. Now, around the same time, I want to tell you a brief story about a woman and her daughter who came to me for help because the daughter stopped speaking in school. And it's a long story, but unfortunately the mom had gotten in an accident and she damaged the front part of her brain right here. And if you take your fingers and put your thumb in the middle like this and put your fingers over the top, this is actually a very useful model of the brain, and in your own skull it would be like this, okay? And this is the model of the brain in the palm of your hand. In fact, everything we're going to talk about is in the palm of your hands, as you'll see. What it turns out is that if you lift up your fingers and lift up your thumb, this deepest part of the brain here and this part here, your thumb and the palm part, are where emotions are generating from input from the body, which is through your spinal cord and your backbone here. So the take-home message is our emotions arise from the body, they interact in the lower part of the brain, and then it's this higher part behind your forehead that coordinates and balances the whole thing. Now, unfortunately, after she had an accident, she lost many, many functions that allowed her to calm her emotions, that allowed her to actually see into her daughter's inner life, what you can call mindsight, to see the mind. She no longer could even see into herself, and as she said, she had lost her soul. And everything had changed. Her daughter became mute, wouldn't talk. And I learned from this, in fact, that the mind is not just something that comes from the activity of the brain. The mind comes also from our relationships with each other. And when you look at it like that, suddenly a bunch of things become clear. And I'll show you in one example now how this works. So just watch me closely. We'll do a close-up. So watch closely at what I'm doing and just notice how you feel. Okay, that's exhibit number 1. Now, notice how you feel when I do this. Now, how many of you felt the difference between exhibit number 1 and exhibit number 2? Raise your hand. What did you feel when I was just moving my hands around? Nothing. You know, it's a random movements. What did you feel when I was doing an intentional act like drinking from a cup? Thirsty? Did anyone feel water going down their throat? Some people are nodding. We have a set of neurons called mirror neurons. They're in our cortex and distributed actually throughout all sorts of parts of the higher part of the brain. And they drive what you see in others that has intention behind it down through the lower parts of the brain and even into the body, so we resonate with other people. This is the neurobiology of compassion. It begins with feeling with another person. So the first step of compassion is we feel with, compassion, with feel. That's where it starts from. Step number 2 is the information that comes up into our awareness, which is mediated in the higher parts of our brain, actually takes the signals from the body that are resonating with other people, that's number 1, and we actually make a map of what's going on in ourselves. It's a mindsight map of me. The next thing we do is in this area that was damaged, unfortunately, in that mom, we make a mindsight map not only of me, but I make a mindsight map of you. We take these two maps and we compare them, and we imagine what is it like to feel what I feel inside, and what is it like to be you. There are all sorts of lessons that come from this, huge lessons about how compassion is both feeling with another person. It also is the beginning of empathy, of having an understanding of another person's point of view. And those two things, feeling with and understanding, are the beginning of the moral imagination, where you not only have a mindsight map of me and a mindsight map of you, you actually have a mindsight map of we. Now, in a moment, in fact, let's do it right now. On the first slide, I'll just show you this brief set of slides. You can say, well, look, the USDA made a new suggestion, because now we're getting to what do you do? You know, what do you do in a school to actually promote compassion? This is this part of the talk. And here's the story. The USDA made a new plate. They said, here's what we should be eating. So David Rock, a colleague of mine in the neuroleadership world, and I came up with a platter, a healthy mind platter. And we said, okay, what are the basic mental ingredients that you need to do every day to keep your mind healthy? Because here's the bottom line. Compassion creates a healthy mind. Reaching out to help other people creates health. The answer to the question of what's the whole thing about happiness and the purpose of life is actually reaching out to connect to others. So how does this work? Well, the issue is our minds come from our relationships as well as our brains that are distributed throughout the whole body. They're not separate. This is the whole thing. The idea of a self as being a singular noun is, as Einstein said, an optical delusion. We're actually plural verbs. We're ever-emerging entities that come from our interactions with each other. Now, you saw in that mind platter a time in practice is what we can do every day. You can, for example, you can do aerobic exercise to keep your bodies healthy. That's good. Sleep, really important. Focus your mind, very good. We do that in schools all the time. Have playtime, extremely important for creativity. Even downtime, just to relax at recess. All those are very important. The two mental nutrients we're going to focus on right now very briefly are the nutrients of time in and connecting time. What's time in? Time in is something that everyone should do every day to reflect inward on the inner nature of their lives, their sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts, so they sift through their inner world. Not just being glued to a computer, but looking inward. And this is one example of something that we've now given to thousands of people, kids, teenagers, and adults, the Wheel of Awareness, as an example of a time and practice that literally integrates the brain and stimulates, we believe, the activity of the mindsight circuits that are essential for compassion. And very briefly, you can see there are 5 senses that bring in the outside world on this outer rim. There's a 6th sense of the body that kids need to learn how to become in touch with their bodies, not just digital screens. There's the 7th sense of knowing what your mental life is, and there's an 8th sense of knowing you are not just you, you're also connected to me, and you're a part of we. To make this world different, we have to realize that the self is plural. It's an absolute delusion that's killing the planet to think that the self is separate. So you can see in the brain, actually, the way you focus attention changes the circuits of the brain. That's all you need to know about brain science. A teacher, like the beautiful talks we've heard about how to actually engage students in the learning process, when a teacher does that, he or she is focusing the attention of their students, and the focus of attention literally snags the brain. It stimulates neuronal activation and growth. We've proven that now. It's not a guess. We know it's true. This brain is changing not just in child and adolescence. It's remodeling all the way into the mid-20s in the United States. It changes throughout the lifespan. And on the next slide, you can see that these are the functions, and we'll go one by one. You learn to regulate your body, to attune to other people. These are all that come from this middle area of the brain. If you put your fingers together again, this is the part of the brain right here behind your middle fingernails. This is the kind of education we need, a prefrontal education. Look at these functions. Let's go through all 9 of them. Body regulation, attuning to others, emotional balance, calming fears. The next, getting insight into yourself, empathy for others, moral imagination, and intuition, the final one. Now look at this list of 9 things. Let me ask all of you who are parents, teachers, friends of parents and teachers, how many of this list of 9 would you like in your life personally? Raise your hand. All of them, right? How many of you would like your student, when they're graduating in 12th grade, to have this be what's on their report card? Okay, these are the outcome if we have a new approach to education. Instead of just reading, writing, arithmetic, we need to have a new 3 R's, which is reflection, relationships, and resilience. And if we do that, it's a total game changer about what the future is going to be. We have an unbelievable potential as human beings when we realize we are in this together to create a more compassionate world. On the next slide, this is the idea. When you develop mindsight in yourself, which is emotional literacy, it's emotional intelligence, the capacity to know your own mind and the mind of others, and promote something called integration, you can actually change the course of the future. You are cultural evolutionists. You can change what the future is. And what I'm going to suggest to you is, on this last slide, is that if we say, okay, let's have kids eating well, have good air to breathe, clean water to drink, safe environments to live in, but then we also have to take care of the mind. And if we do these daily mental activities, if we give kids the directions on how to actually develop a healthy mind, we'll realize that compassion and kindness are as natural to all of us as the breath is to life. Thank you very much.